All right, I will let Rachel kind of bring her slides up and whatever her materials are. And I just want to welcome everyone. It's been a few months since we've hosted a talk, and that's because we had some great aphasia conferences going on. We had Academy of Aphasia, Society for Neurobiology of Language. So we just postponed some of these because we figured people were a little virtualed out, we'll put it that way. So super happy to be hosting these again, and we've got some great talks planned for the spring, so keep updated on our website. I did post in the chat as well, if you'd like a letter confirming attendance for today, just send me an email. I'm happy to give that to you. And without further ado, I will have Rachel introduce herself because it's always way better than me attempting it. But I'm super excited to have her here because she's a unique speaker and that she's not affiliated with an academic institution. And I think that's really great. So I'm hoping some students who are watching this and even professors who are watching this, speech language pathologists can think of other ways to kind of collaborate, like where these individuals are located and where they're doing research. So I am super happy to host Rachel, and I will turn it over to her.
All right. Thanks, Brielle. I just want to make sure that I have successfully shared the right screen so you can see my
slides. It looks good.
Right? Yeah. Great. Okay, so I'm Rachel Ostrand. I'm a research scientist at IBM Research, as Brielle mentioned. This is, you may be aware, not a university. So I am located in New York, a little bit north of the city, and I've been here for just about 5 years since I got my PhD in cognitive science from UC San Diego. And what I'm doing here is really we have a very basic science research lab, and so it's been a really great experience, getting to really do basic science research, but kind of in an industry environment and kind of getting to partner both with other companies, other industry, but also people in academia. And as you'll see from the talks that the studies that I am talking about today, this is very collaborative work, and I am very open to collaborating, and I really do love collaborating. So please feel free to reach out. Put your thinking caps on and get in touch. Okay, so my talk is about, as you probably saw from the title, spontaneous speech production, and how we can use that as a predictive marker of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's and dementia more broadly, and mild cognitive impairment. Okay, so as probably everyone knows, around the world there's an enormous number of people who are affected by cognitive and mental health disorders, and in particular, neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and other types of dementia really affect a lot of people. And in the US alone, over 6 million people currently have Alzheimer's disease, and especially as the population ages, this number is projected to more than double in the next 40 years. There's currently no cure for Alzheimer's, and in fact most types of dementia, although there are some actions that can be taken if the disease is detected relatively early on. So both palliative measures, which may slow the progression of symptoms, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, as well as giving the affected person the ability to be able to plan their own care when they're still in a position to be able to make decisions for themselves. And so as a result, early detection really is essential for disease management. However, traditional approaches for detection or diagnosis of dementia or mild cognitive impairment can be challenging for a number of reasons. And this is because in general, they center around the fact that they require evaluation by a trained neuropsychologist or other clinician, and this necessitates, so first of all, a highly trained administrator, a substantial time investment by the patient, at least 1 to 2 hours and often much more, travel to a hospital or a clinic or a doctor's office, at time invasive or expensive physical tests, including blood draws, genotyping, neuroimaging, among many others. And so as a result, people are often only assessed by a doctor once their dementia has started causing obvious impairments, enough that their family and friends notice problems with memory or with language or with performing everyday tasks. And what this means is that people aren't being evaluated by a doctor often until their dementia has progressed to a somewhat advanced state. And as a result, this means that they can actually miss out on a lot of the benefits of early intervention that I just mentioned. And in fact, even for people who have already been diagnosed, it's really impractical to visit a clinician frequently in order to kind of track the progression of the disease on kind of relatively short time windows. So what would be really nice is if we had a tool that could be used for what I call semi-continuous monitoring. So not every second of every day, but with a reasonable frequency, once a week, once a month, that could be used for this level of frequency of monitoring of someone's cognitive status, so that we can then predict their degree of impairment into the future and track their progression over time. And so maybe from the title of my talk, you'll see where I'm going with this. But we know that from clinical and case study work that speech production can be affected by dementia or MCI, potentially even very early on, decades before major behavioral symptoms, like the famous nun study, in which essays were written by nuns as they entered a convent as young women. And these essays, linguistic properties of these essays, in particular syntax, were fairly predictive of whether they developed dementia late in life, as much as 60 or 70 years later. And this comes about likely because language production is a really complex cognitive system. It seems really easy, you open your mouth and words come out, although given the audience here, probably I don't need to convince you guys that language production is complex. But importantly, it's interconnected to and it draws on many other systems. So memory, attention, executive function, motor control, all of this. And so as a result, we could expect, even just from a neurological or cognitive point of view, that underlying impairment in one of these other systems could be reflected in signatures in speech. And if these linguistic signatures can be identified and measured, then speech could be diagnostic of a person's underlying cognitive state. And in addition, spontaneous speech has a lot of really nice properties. So first of all, it's really easy to produce for most people. I add that as a caveat, but certainly for the majority of people in the world. Second, it's really easy to collect and requires very minimal equipment to do that. It also imposes extremely low burden on the patient or the caregiver, certainly in comparison to many medical diagnostic tests. And it's largely immune to conscious manipulation. So this means that it's likely not obvious to a participant how they should respond if they wanted to induce a higher or lower score. And the last point here, I think, is maybe even the most important, which is that speech is a more realistic measure of a person's real-life activities, right? Clinical diagnostic tests, of course, are incredibly important and have a very major and important role in life and in medicine. But it probably matters more to grandma's day-to-day life if she's having trouble communicating and having trouble interacting with those around her, compared to if she doesn't know the name of the county that she's in or what day of the week it is. So we have reason to believe that speech could be a strong diagnostic marker of MCI and dementia, and it avoids a lot of logistical challenges of traditional clinical instruments. So just to return to the slide that I showed earlier, a couple slides ago, with some of the logistical challenges of traditional assessments, it turns out that capturing speech actually is a nice way of handling all of these challenges. So first, you don't really need training for participants. People on the whole know how to talk. You don't need a lot of time because just a few minutes can produce a very rich sample of speech. Participants don't need to travel because speech can be collected anywhere where the participant is. It's completely non-invasive. And speech can be collected using very inexpensive equipment. So all you need is a microphone, and maybe this is equipment that your participant already has, like a smartphone, which they carry around in their pocket all the time and has great microphones. So just to take a step back, I paint a very rosy picture here about how great speech production is. And if you know me, this is probably no surprise. My whole dissertation was on speech production. I used to tell people when I was starting doing research that I went into studying speech production rather than speech comprehension because I like to talk more than I like to listen. But maybe some of you are kind of shouting at your computer screen with your videos off so I can't see you, that I've kind of conveniently overlooked a major hurdle, which is that discourse analysis is very time consuming and training intensive. And so even if the data collection part of speech production is scalable, then the data analysis part likely is not. And so that brings me to the topic of my research. So the work that I'll be discussing today is investigating whether we can elicit spontaneous speech, determine various linguistic properties which are diagnostic of cognitive status, so MCI or dementia, and then importantly, automatically calculate those properties from transcripts. And just as a point, automatic computation of certain linguistic properties from transcripts is not a new invention. This has been going on in computer science, in natural language processing for quite some time. But the key here is that we don't want to calculate just any old linguistic properties that we can think of. We specifically want to be able to automatically calculate ones which are predictive of cognitive decline. So the research questions that I'm addressing here are, first, are there specific linguistic properties which are reliable indicators of a person's current cognitive status? And if so, what are they? And as a corollary to that, are there linguistic properties which are predictive of a person's future cognitive status? And lastly, can these features be calculated automatically rather than needing to rely on the time and labor-intensive process of manual annotation? So today I'll be talking about two experiments with different populations in which we calculated speech and neuropsychological test scores and looked at the predictive relationship between them. And then finally, I'll talk about a third study which investigates the feasibility of administering this spontaneous speech production methodology in an entirely unsupervised manner, actually every week over the course of a year. Okay, so moving on to study one. The participants here were adults in a senior living community in Ohio. All participants in the study completed one session, so we had 39 participants at the first session, and most of those, 30 of them, returned for a second session, which was approximately 1 year later. Had a sort of moderate age range from 68 to 90, about a 2-to-1 ratio of female to male participants. English was the dominant, and for most of them, only language. For all of the participants, everyone was tested in English. And this was actually a fairly highly educated sample. Everyone had at least a high school education, and most people had college or more. And that's because most of these participants were retired professors or other professionals who from the local university. Okay, and so for the clinical assessment, participants were administered a neuropsychological battery. It was the identical battery at both study visits under the supervision of a clinical neuropsychologist, my colleague. And the neuropsychological battery included a number of different cognitive tests, but here I'll be focusing on the 3MS, the Modified Mini Mental State Exam. And this is a measure of global cognitive abilities which assesses attention, memory, executive function, and language. And it provides a score of cognitive status. It's been shown to have very high reliability and validity. And just a note that higher scores reflect better cognitive function. And we also administered a number of other cognitive tests, which I'm leaving aside for now, although I'm happy to welcome input about using these tests in conjunction with speech, during the Q&A or later. Okay, and then on the speech production side, so the participant was given 2 types of speech elicitation tasks. So the first was picture description. So we used everyone's old friend, the cookie theft picture, as well as 2 other similar style pictures, although a little less 1950s housewife-esque. And the second speech elicitation prompt were what I call expository tasks. So these were open-ended questions and included a discussion about an important person in the participant's life and a place that was meaningful to them, and then retelling the fairy tale of Cinderella. That was only in session 2. And just one point, what I'm discussing here is actually only the speech from session 1, but the cognitive scores from both session 1 and session 2. Okay, so in the analyses that I'll be presenting, the linguistic features were calculated on each of the 3 pictures and the 2 expository tasks, and then were averaged within task, and this produces a more stable measure of the participants' language production ability. So that means that even if they didn't have a lot to say about the cookie theft, they produced a really short response, then the responses from the other 2 pictures, the features were averaged together and combined, and that helps to kind of smooth out any unusual, effects of outliers in response to one particular picture or one particular prompt. Just one other note before I launch into the details of the experiment. We included multiple speech tasks here because there's reason to believe that some types of speech tasks may be better able to elicit certain linguistic features compared to others, because certain types of features may end up being differentially indicative of cognitive status. So for example, picture descriptions, they're somewhat artificial, but they elicit speech describing a standardized input, and thus may facilitate cross-participant comparisons because everyone is looking at the same things, they're kind of saying the same nouns. And so, for example, a picture that has a bunch of specific concepts that are extremely salient, like the cookie theft, might provide a starker contrast between healthy and impaired speakers on dimensions like production of nouns and pronouns. And in contrast, expository speech tasks will likely elicit longer and more emotionally invested responses, and these more closely resemble speech production kind of in the wild. And so expository tasks, as a result, may reduce topic constraints and allow for a wider range of speaking time across participants, and thus better capture between participant variability in things like total words produced, lexical frequency, lexical diversity, things like that, more discourse measures than kind of part of speech measures. Okay, so participant speech was recorded and transcribed from each of these prompts, and then a set of 16 lexical semantic features known to be affected in dementia were selected, and these were identified from case studies and clinical literature. And lexical semantic, probably everyone here knows this, but lexical semantic means that these features relate to the types of words that the person used and the meaning of those words. So for example, are they using more nouns versus pronouns? Are they mostly using more common, easy words like dog or cat, or are they also using uncommon, harder words like platypus or onomatopoeia? That's operationalized by the first bullet here, lexical frequency. And then lastly, we automatically calculated these features using the programming language Python. So once we have the speech transcripts, then I press a button and get out an Excel sheet full of all of the numbers of these speech features. So no one needs to know anything about linguistics or do any sort of manual annotation to get these numbers. Okay, and then for the analysis that I'll be presenting, I conducted multiple linear regression using the 16 linguistic features jointly as predictors, and then the 3MS clinical score is the outcome variable. And so there's 2 analyses I'm going to be presenting. First, looking at whether characteristics of speech is diagnostic of current cognitive status. So to do that, we use the features computed on session 1 speech and use that to predict session 1 3MS score. And second, asking, is speech predictive of future cognitive status? And to do that, we use the same linguistic features calculated on the same session 1 speech, but instead use it to predict session 2 3MS score. Okay, so what we see for does speech predict current cognitive status? We see that, yes, indeed, linguistic features significantly predict current cognitive status. So let me just orient you to the graphs here. On the left shows the results from the linguistic features calculated on the speech elicited by the picture description tasks. On the right is the same, but the speech from the expository description tasks. So these graphs are basically showing the same results, but on the 2 different types of speech elicitation tasks. And for both graphs, the x-axis shows the observed 3MS score. So that's the score that the participant actually received from the clinical test. The neuropsychologist administered the 3MS, and that's on the x-axis, what they actually got. On the y-axis is the predicted 3MS score. So using only the linguistic features calculated from the participant's spontaneous speech, what is our prediction of what that participant's 3MS score is? So if I was truly magical and linguistic features were completely 100% predictive of a participant's 3MS score, then the line should be exactly the y equals x line. So it should be a perfect diagonal. And all of the points should lie exactly on the line. Of course, that's not the case. There's behavioral variability, but basically the closer the points are to the line means there's less error in prediction. And so what you can see is that both speech tasks do a fairly good job of predicting 3MS score. And in fact, they're both significantly better than chance. And I've put the R and the p-values here for both of the analyses. And just a statistical note for all you statistics buffs. For all the multiple regression analyses that I'm presenting here, these and the ones following, I present what's called adjusted R values. And this is just a way of statistically correcting for having multiple predictors in the model, so that it's not overfitting and producing a spurious result. So basically, the way it works is the statistical test penalizes the R value for each additional predictor that's entered into the model. So with more predictors, you hope you'll be able to explain more of the variance in the outcome variable, but you also get dinged every time you add an additional predictor. So it's just a way of controlling, if I put in infinite predictors, then I would have perfect predictability, but adjusted R would take care of that. Okay, and so additionally, as an exploratory measure to investigate the relationship between each linguistic feature and 3MS score, then we calculated separate simple regressions between each linguistic feature and 3MS. So again, trying to predict the 3MS using just this participant's lexical frequency. And again, just a statistics note, we corrected all of these p-values for multiple comparisons using Benjamini-Hochberg. So hopefully there's no p-hacking going on here. Well, there is not p-hacking going on here. Okay, and so here I'm showing the correlations for the highest predictive linguistic features calculated on each of the 2 speech elicitation tasks. And we see that for both speech elicitation tasks, lexical frequency was negatively correlated with 3MS. So that means that participants with poorer cognitive function produced higher frequency words, so words that are more common and kind of easier to produce. And in addition, the use of definite articles and determiners were each positively correlated with cognitive score, again, such that participants with higher 3MS and so less impaired produced a higher proportion of definite articles and determiners in their speech. And similarly with nouns, we see that the number of nouns as a proportion of total words was positively correlated with cognitive score. But one thing that's interesting when we look at these features is that with the exception of lexical frequency, the simple regressions are only significant on the speech elicited from the picture descriptions and not from the expository descriptions, which is interesting because the full set of linguistic features actually did a better job when calculated on the expository descriptions compared to the picture descriptions. So that's sort of an interesting contrast. So I'll return to this point in a little while. Okay, and so then, as I mentioned before, the second goal of the present work was to determine whether linguistic features predict future cognitive status. So to that end, we assessed whether a multiple linear regression using this set of 16 linguistic features calculated on session 1 speech could predict that participants' session 2 3MS scores. So we're using their speech to try to predict someone's cognitive score a year into the future. And here we see that features from the expository task significantly predicted future 3MS. This is on the right graph. However, features calculated from the picture description task did not, and that's the left graph. And one thing also that's interesting is that the expository speech tasks in the right graph explained a similar amount of variance in session 2 clinical scores as they did the session 1 clinical scores, so the previous graphs that I showed you. And so this raises the possibility that expository prompts, which are less constrained, more open-ended, may be better able to capture the types of linguistic features that can predict future cognitive decline, because they're able to capture more aspects of linguistic variability, which are themselves kind of early warning markers of future MCI. So that's very much a kind of post hoc hypothesis that I have, and should definitely be further explored. But I think it's kind of an intriguing possibility. Okay, and again, similar to the relationship with concurrent cognitive status, looking at the individual linguistic features here, we see that average lexical frequency was negatively correlated with cognitive status a year in the future. Again, this was only significant in the expository description tasks, although it's marginal in the picture description tasks. And as you can see, none of the other individual features were significantly correlated with 3MS 1 year later. Although some of the R values are still relatively large. This is probably due to a relatively small sample size. There's fewer people at session 2 who came back for session 2, and the correction for multiple comparisons. So none of them crossed the significance threshold. Some of them are marginal. Again, it's possible that this might be significant if we had a larger sample size, but again, that's very much an area for future research. It's intriguing, but inconclusive. Okay, so moving on to the second study. This was very similar in design, but had some important differences in terms of population. So this is part of a very broad and long-lasting Offspring study of racial and ethnic disparities in Alzheimer's disease. This is with some collaborators at Columbia University. This is a community-based study of middle-aged and older adults who live in Upper Manhattan. We had a larger sample size here, 112. That number will continue to grow as we continue to test people. The age range was even broader, so ranging from 32 to 89. And also importantly, we have much more racial and ethnic diversity in this sample, a somewhat more balanced ratio of female to male participants, also more diversity in the participants' native language, and also a somewhat larger portion of the sample, about a quarter of the sample, who had less than a high school education or did not complete high school. So in general, both larger sample size and more diverse on a number of demographic measures. And so for this study, a very substantial neuropsychological and demographic and imaging battery was administered, but here I'll be discussing just 3 clinical tasks: the selective reminding test delayed recall score, the SRT total recall score, and semantic fluency as measured by animal naming. Okay, so the speech elicitation prompts in the study were slightly different, but along the same lines. So first, we gave them a structured interview in which the experimenter asked a series of questions about the participant's life. Again, I'm happy to talk more about the specific questions, but along the lines of, who is the person that influenced you the most? What accomplishment are you the most proud of? Things like that. Second, they were asked to talk about the difference between their generation and the one preceding and the one following. And finally, to talk about their most memorable vacation. And in the analyses I'll be presenting, I'm actually only including the structured interview because not enough subjects were administered the other 2 tasks, because those were added to the protocol later on, but those are also coming. Okay, and so participants chose which language, English or Spanish, to do the tasks in. And the data I'm presenting here, everyone was tested in English, but the Spanish-speaking participants are coming soon, so stay tuned. Okay, so as with the previous study, participant speech was recorded and transcribed, and 14 lexical semantic features were automatically calculated on the speech transcripts. These are exactly the same linguistic features as we used in the previous study, with the exception of speech rate and filler word rate were removed because given the much larger sample size, we didn't want to deal with timestamping the transcriptions for this study. And it turned out that the 2 rate variables were sort of totally non-predictive anyway, so we figured, why waste our time? This is supposed to be automatic. Okay, so the analyses for the study are also very similar to the previous, with the exception that we also added demographic variables as predictors. And this was done for two reasons. So for a statistical reason, first, we had a much larger sample size, so that can support a larger number of predictors in the statistical model. And second, for a scientific reason, which is that there was substantially more demographic diversity in this sample. So we felt that modeling that could really be important. So the 14 spontaneous speech features and 6 demographic variables, which I list here, were jointly entered as predictors in several multiple regressions to predict each of the neuropsychological outcome variables. And we know that just demographics alone have a strong relationship with some of these neuropsychological measures. So we used model comparison to investigate whether adding linguistic features provided explanatory power over and above that of the demographics alone. And so we ran these correlations on the 3 clinical outcome variables that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so first, looking at the outcome variable of SRT delayed recall, we see that linguistic features significantly predicted degree of memory impairment. So adding this set, the linguistic properties calculated on participant speech significantly improves the model fit beyond just the demographics. So again, what we see here, the x-axis is the participant's actual SRT delayed recall score, and the y-axis is what did we predict their score would be using just their speech features and demographic variables. And again, you can see that, the line is positive sloping, it's, fairly slopey. The dots are, reasonably clustered around. These are all very technical statistical descriptors that I'm providing you, although the actual statistics are on the slide. And so I thought I would also share the predictions from the 2 what I call individual models as well. And so we see clearly in the center graph, which uses both the participants' demographics as well as their speech properties, the center graph produces the best predictions of each participant's delayed recall score compared to the other 2. So on the right is the model which uses only demographics. It's clearly better than nothing. Again, this is not new information. We know there is a relationship between demographic properties and cognitive score as measured by clinical instruments, but it kind of provides us with a baseline of where we might expect our predictive ability to start. And on the left is the model which uses only the set of linguistic features as predictors. It does less good of a job than the center graph does, but in fact does a better job than the demographics alone. And so this suggests that combining these 2 sources of information, participant speech properties and demographic information, might be really a fruitful endeavor for predicting their cognitive scores. Okay, and so in contrast, moving on to predicting SRT total recall scores, we find that the set of linguistic features actually were not associated with participants' degree of learning here. And when we look at all 3 of the graphs, the individual graphs and the individual models and the combined model in the middle, we just don't see good predictive power for anything to predict total recall scores. And I admit that's a little bit of a mystery to me. But again, I would welcome thoughts. I am not being a neuropsychologist. I am not super familiar with the kind of details of what delayed recall versus total recall might be kind of specifically capturing kind of underlyingly in terms of impairment. And so I'm welcome any thoughts on the matter. Okay, and finally, as a type of reliability measure, we looked at whether characteristics of a person's spontaneous speech are predictive of their semantic fluency score. So semantic fluency is I give you a category and say you have a minute to name all of the things you can think of in this category. So here we used animals, so I say, okay, think of all the animals, tell me all the animals you can name in a minute. And so on the one hand, you might expect spontaneous speech features and semantic fluency to be closely related. They're, of course, both measures of speech production and lexical access. But on the other hand, they're actually very different tasks. Semantic fluency is a controlled, really explicit search of the mental lexicon, looking for matches to a given category. And so as a result, it's basically a test of semantic memory retrieval. And in contrast, spontaneous speech, of course, is more natural, but it also has a lot more avenues for variability, which also means that there's a lot more avenues for compensation by the speaker. So that's why we thought of this as sort of a reliability measure, but also perhaps quite predictive, as fluency scores are often used in diagnostic tests as well. And so here we see a very strong relationship. The linguistic features and demographics together did an excellent job of predicting semantic fluency scores. And in addition, the linguistic features added an enormous and significant amount of predictive power over and above the demographics alone. And in fact, here, when we look at the two individual models, the linguistic features alone, shown in the left graph, even without the moderating demographic variables, actually significantly predicted the semantic fluency scores, as I said on the figure on the left. Okay, so far, all of the data that I presented was collected with an experimenter administering the speech elicitation prompts. So hopefully that's been at least fairly convincing that we really can use some automatically calculable properties of spontaneous speech to predict someone's cognitive score and MCI or dementia status. But what we're doing here is still, the analysis is automatic, but it still requires, an experimenter. These participants, well, they were all coming into the lab before COVID, and after COVID, we're still, doing this over the phone, and there's still, a reasonable amount of sort of experimenter overhead. I think it's still an advantage over traditional assessments in some ways, since the experimenter can be a research assistant who's trained on the speech task. They don't need to be a licensed neuropsychologist or other clinician or someone who knows how to administer these technical clinical tasks. But I think really an important question remains, which I haven't shown you anything about, is could a spontaneous speech elicitation task like this be rolled out really autonomously? And so I don't have direct data to speak to this with a sample of people suffering from MCI or cognitive decline or dementia, although this is something I am really interested in working on. So if any of you are running a study involving elderly participants at home or have other ideas or potentially interested in collaborating on this, please do get in touch. Anyway, so what I'm going to present is a slightly different population, but is basically a proof of concept of the feasibility of a methodology and a protocol for frequent, longitudinal, and objective patient tracking using spontaneous speech production. The participants here come from a very large-scale clinical trial involving participants who suffered from chronic pain. They did lots of other things during the study, but one component was that they were issued a smartphone and received a speech elicitation prompt on their phone screen once a week, and were asked to record a few-minute response, and they just recorded it right into the phone. The recording was automatically uploaded to our servers, and then we could grab it and run our analyses. And these participants, because they were enrolled in this ongoing clinical study, they were enrolled for up to 3 years. The data I'm presenting here covers a fixed 1-year window, but kind of shows the feasibility of people really kind of staying in the study for the long term. And here's a brief overview of the participant characteristics. Okay, so in order to be considered a feasible methodology, we defined 3 evaluation measurements as important indicators of success, of our participants really engaging and complying with this spontaneous speech task. So first is low participant burden, which we defined as the time between when the prompt appeared on the patient's phone and when they submitted their response. So are they, responding to the prompt in a timely manner, or are they letting it sit around forever, and only, if they're harassed for weeks and weeks, do they finally respond? Second, we were looking for high participant engagement, which we operationalized by the length of their speech response. And our goal length was 1.5 to 2 minutes of speech. And finally, we were looking for high participant compliance, and so this is just the submission rate. So the percentage of prompts that the participant received, what percent did they actually respond to? Okay, so for burden, we found that participants generally responded within a day after the prompt appeared on their phone, which I think is pretty good. You know, doesn't have to be instantly, right? Maybe you're in the middle of doing something, but a day is a pretty good lag. Second, as for engagement, on average, actually participants hit exactly the target response lengths that we were looking for. We had 2 different types of questions in the study. The distinction is not relevant. I split them out only because we had different goal lengths for each of them, and participants hit really exactly the goal length for each of them. And finally, we actually had reasonably high compliance. So overall, 62% of speech prompts were responded to, which, you know, is not perfect, but it's a lot better than it could be. It's hard to know what exactly the baseline expectation should be here, but it's higher than 0, so I consider that a win. Although one thing you can see in this figure is actually there is a very substantial amount of variability in submission rate between participants. So here, I know the font is tiny because I put too much stuff on the slide, but along the x-axis, each bar is 1 participant, and the y-axis shows that participant's submission rate going from 0 to 100%. So you see there are actually some participants who, over on the left, who never submitted a response. That's all the blank space on the left. And then, you know, it goes up, and then there are some participants who responded to basically every prompt. So clearly there are just sort of personality differences and things like that. And so I share this just as a brief overview to demonstrate that a spontaneous speech elicitation method could really be feasible as a frequent assessment tool, and even potentially administered without oversight from an experimenter. As overall, the participants in this study seemed willing to engage with the speech elicitation tasks and participate. And these data, of course, do come with the caveats that, first of all, there is a lot of individual variability. Clearly, some people are more interested and willing to participate than others. And second, there may well, of course, be added challenges of, you know, uptake and compliance in a population with memory impairments. But I think as a starting point, this is really encouraging data. Okay, so just to wrap up here, what I hope I've shown you is that first, certain linguistic features are correlated with current and future clinical cognitive scores, although of course we already knew that to some extent. But next, that speech can be collected easily and therefore frequently, and importantly, that the meaningful characteristics, which are predictive of cognitive status, can be computed automatically. And so this greatly reduces the huge barrier of time and labor-intensive manual annotation and coding work. And this means that it could be feasible to test at-risk individuals earlier, before they show behavioral symptoms, and or administer assessments on a regular basis to monitor an at-risk individual or track progression of cognitive decline. And also, speech-based prediction as a result of this, right, could be the outcome of this prediction could be shared with a doctor or family member, allowing for further clinical screening at a critical moment. And just to be clear, the goal of this research is very much not to put clinicians out of business. You know, I envision this research as a supplemental tool, a way of flagging which people are in need of formal clinical assessments and being able to get those individual assessments and care at a time when they need it. And lastly, this could all lead to earlier detection of mild cognitive impairment and potentially dementia as well, which gives the participant and their loved ones and their doctor more time to figure out a clinical and a personal course of action. So I'll just close very quickly with sort of dreams of future directions. What are some things that I would love to be able to do in the future? So first of all, larger sample size. Data collection remains ongoing, especially in the second study I presented. I would also really love to have more diversity in terms of cognition, so degree of impairment, diagnosis, things like that. First language, as I mentioned briefly earlier, we're currently working on writing the automatic analysis code for Spanish. So I hope to have some data from Spanish-speaking participants within the next couple of months. And then, of course, it would really be great to expand to other languages and other locations as well. And more diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. I think it would also be really interesting to investigate the relationship between speech and imaging or genetic markers. There's actually a number of these markers that have been collected as part of the second study that I described, so I hope those will be forthcoming at some point as well. Something that's really kind of top of mind for me is trying to have a longer time lag and more longitudinal data. And in fact, this is a bit of a sad tale. The intention of study 1 was to follow this cohort over several years, and that was in progress, but data collection is unfortunately just completely on pause due to COVID for various kind of protocol reasons. So, you know, I would love to be able to pick that up, and obviously longitudinal data requires waiting around for a long time. So, you know, the sooner you start, the better. And finally, some way of kind of rolling this out in the wild. So doing something like I described in study 3, but with participants with MCI or dementia, you know, giving them a task of being able to, you know, collect speech from them at home on a frequent basis and being able to, you know, track that over the course of a year or two. And so kind of as part of that, you know, I'd love to be, I think something that could be really interesting is kind of being part of the development of a remote speech collection app. And, you know, I'm not a developer, I'm not a software engineer, but I think this is a really interesting avenue for future work and collaboration and has a lot of potential. So I just want to thank my collaborators on the projects that I mentioned, as well as the many research assistants and experimenters who put in tons of time and effort for these projects, and also acknowledge some funding from the NIH and the Cleveland Brain Health Initiative. And lastly, I just, you know, very much want to encourage any of you to get in touch. I'm always eager to hear new ideas or opportunities for collection. And I'd love to be able to work with people who are interested in these directions as well. All right.